My lecture on Donald Davidson and his theory of radical interpretation is going to be very short. Please consider it just as an appendix to the previous one on Willard van Orman Quine. Donald Davidson was an American philosopher of language and mind. He was a bit younger than Quine, and we can consider him Quine's student and colleague at the same time. Davidson wrote only short papers that were collected in 5 volumes of philosophical essays. I believe that the most important one for philosophers and linguists are his inquiries into truth and interpretation. These were published in 1984 and are the 2nd volume of philosophical essays. I think that Davidson's philosophy was a mixture of logical empiricism and Quine's philosophy. Let's start with his updated verification theory of meaning. According to Davidson, understanding the meaning of a sentence is understanding its truth conditions. We know that from my lecture of Carnap and about Quine. To understand a sentence means that we understand the condition when the sentence is true or false. But Davidson's account is a bit updated, mainly through Quine's theory of radical translation. It is safe to say that Davidson just reviewed Quine's theory of radical translation, and he updated and translated the name from radical translation to radical interpretation, and I'll try to explain why. Quine usually talked about translation between 2 completely unrelated languages, for example, between English and a non-existent Indian language that Quine called Jungleese, and that included, for example, the term Gavagai. But in 1968, Quine wrote quite important article called Ontological Relativity, and in there he started to explain that radical translation begins at home. According to Quine, we use radical translation even in cases when we talk with speakers of the same language as we do. Davidson in 1973 put it in a better way. According to Davidson, all understanding of the speech of another involves radical interpretation. As you can see here, Davidson uses interpretation instead of translation. The term translation might be a bit counterintuitive. So, according to Davidson, we have to use radical translation even when speakers use the same language. Not only Davidson said so, it is also the idea of Quine. And to make it clear, Davidson introduced the theory of radical interpretation and the term radical interpretation. According to Davidson, the aim of any conversation is understanding. This is why we talk. This is why we write and read. We want to understand others. And to do this, we must try to understand others, and we must try to be understood by others. We have to use radical interpretation to achieve this aim. The most important term of Davidson's theory of language and his theory of communication is the principle of charity. As I said before, we have to be charitable to the others when talking, writing, reading, and listening. It means that we have to be generous and open-minded when we try to understand the others. And again, we have to be generous, charitable, and open-minded when we try to communicate what we mean to the others. To understand this principle of charity in a more efficient way, let me read a quite large quote from Davidson's essay on the very idea of a conceptual scheme from 1974. To understand what's going on in this quote, you have to know the terms ketch, yawl and jigger. Ketch and yawl are two kinds of yachts, two kinds of boats, and the difference between ketch and yawl is in the position of the jigger, which is a kind of sail that you can see in these pictures. So, let me quote. If you see a ketch sailing by and your companion says, "Look at that handsome yawl," you may be faced with a problem of interpretation. One natural possibility is that your friend has mistaken a ketch for a yawl and has formed a false belief. But if his vision is good and his line of sight favorable, it is even more plausible that he does not use the word yawl quite as you do, and has made no mistake at all about the position of the jigger on the passing yacht. We do this sort of off-the-cuff interpretation all the time, deciding in favor of reinterpretation of words in order to preserve a reasonable theory of belief. Which means that, according to Davidson, we have to do these small trade-offs between what a person means by his or her words and what a person tries to communicate using his or her words. Sometimes there might be a mismatch between these two, but we have to use principle of charity again to understand what's going on. I hope you understand that Quine's theory of radical translation or Davidson's account of radical interpretation are much more advanced and precise theories of communication than the older ones I have mentioned during this semester. For example, you cannot deal with ketches and yawls sailing on the open sea using Wittgenstein's picture theory of language. According to Wittgenstein 1, every proposition is a picture of the fact, and there are no facts in Davidson's example about radical interpretation. They are just hypotheses that we want to test or verify in our communications. Using Davidson's radical interpretation, we can deal with such strange phenomena as metaphors in natural language. Davidson wrote on the account of metaphors this: "Metaphor is the dream work of language, and like all dream work, its interpretation reflects as much on the interpreter as on the originator. The interpretation of dreams requires collaboration between a dreamer and a waker, even if they be the same person. And the act of interpretation is itself a work of the imagination. So to understand in a metaphor is as much a creative endeavor as making a metaphor, and as little guided by rules." This approach is strongly against language games too. Wittgenstein thought that communication is ruled by quite precise rules. Quine and Davidson are against these thoughts because they understand that understanding is very creative. We have to invest a lot of cognitive work when dealing with language. When you communicate with the others, you have to be creative to understand what they mean. And usually, you cannot use any explicit or implicit rules to understand what they wanted to express. Davidson, in his writings, invented a very famous example of creative usage of language, and these are Malapropisms. Mrs. Malaprop, from Richard Sheridan's play The Rivals, that was written in 1775, wants to sound intelligent and well educated, but unfortunately for her, she cannot use English properly. I think that you all know someone like her, someone who wants to sound intelligent, but unfortunately is not able to do that. For example, Mrs. Malaprop says in that play, "He will dissolve my mystery." What she wanted to say was, of course, something else. "He will resolve my mystery." To understand malapropisms like these, you have to be creative. You cannot follow any explicit rule. You have to understand what's happening in the mind of Mrs. Malaprop or any other speaker to get in touch with her mental processes and what she might understand as true. Another example is this one. "She's as headstrong as an allegory on the banks of Nile." You can see that this sentence sounds also a bit strange. That's because Mrs. Malaprop again made a mistake when creating it. She wanted to say, "She's as headstrong as an alligator on the banks of Nile." And another one, "His physiognomy so grammatical should be his phraseology so grammatical." Small difference in a sound, but huge difference in its meaning. And the most sophisticated example of malapropism is this one. "Sure, if I reprehend anything in this world, it is the use of my oracular tongue and a nice arrangement of epitaphs." Mrs. Malaprop made a lot of mistakes when producing this sentence. There are at least 4 words improperly used because she wanted to say, "Sure, if I apprehend anything in this world, it is the use of my vernacular tongue and a nice arrangement of epithets." Again, the point is the same. We can understand these sentences even in cases when they include a mistake, or a lot of them. The reason for it is that we are all charitable. We use principle of charity in our radical interpretation of the thoughts of others. And this is the main idea of the whole Quinean and Davidsonian theory of meaning. Let me finish my lectures on Quine and Davidson with 2 final remarks. The first one is just a revision of what I said already about preschoolers and small kids. Please have on your minds that radical translation or radical interpretation is the only way how to get acquainted with the language. It means that small kids have to use this method when acquiring their first language, their mother tongue. There is nothing else they can do. It's not important if there's something in it, according to Quine and Davidson, who are quite skeptical about that. The important part is that you have to use radical interpretation and the principle of charity to understand the language and to be understood when speaking or writing. That's it. My second remark is about xenolinguistics. This is just a fancy word for alien linguistics, for linguistics dealing with languages of aliens from other solar systems. Of course, we haven't met any aliens with language yet, I want to add, but we have to be prepared for this. And again, please have on your minds that when we meet, or if we meet someone like this, some alien speaker of an alien language, the only way how to understand it, him or her, is through radical interpretation or radical translation. We have just few examples of talking to aliens. We haven't heard from them yet again, but Pioneer Plague, for example, is a nice example of how to talk to them. If you don't know, Pioneer Plague is a pair of gold anodized aluminum plaques that were placed on board the 1972 Pioneer 10 and 1973 Pioneer 11 spacecraft. And both of these vehicles feature a pictorial message that you can see on the right side of this slide. There is no language involved except of mathematics on the left side, and there's also a diagram of our solar system with a small picture of this spacecraft Pioneer. And there are also two diagrams of a man and woman, and behind them you can see again a Pioneer spacecraft to understand how we are big and tall. Well, that's probably that for today. You have some food for thought, and I have just one recommendation on the next slide. We do not have any required or recommended reading for this week. I think that Quine's word and object from the last lecture was enough for some time. But I would like to recommend a film this week. It is called Arrival. It's from 2016 and it was directed by Canadian Denis Villeneuve. It's a science fiction flick with a lot of famous actors in it, and a few years ago it got a lot of excellent reviews. I think that the film is quite okay. Its screenplay is a bit dull or stupid maybe, because I think that the creators didn't know a lot about linguistics and physics and theory of relativity. But I still recommend. It's the best film on xenolinguistics we have, and if you are interested in stuff like this, please watch it and we can discuss it on our next online meeting.